My name is Mary Gray. I'm co-chairing with Jackie ONeill on this session, one of the last of the day, on Workers of the World Connect. So hopefully you're here for that session. And one of our panelists, Louise Hickman, is remote. She was stopped at customs in Heathrow. I'm sure many of us can feel a lot of empathy for that, and many of us probably feel deep embarrassment for that. But we have a video that she's recorded. So the flow of the day, the goal of this is to get to conversation as quickly as possible. So each of our panelists has prepared 10 minutes of remarks, and we have a few questions that we've decided we'd like to start with among the panelists, and we can, as quickly as possible, move to your questions and have some discussion. But the framing for this is that several of us are working on kind of the practicalities of what kinds of tools facilitate communication, conversation, and particularly thinking about mobile and conversational agents as a way of promoting agency and connection among workforces. But of course, that has to take into consideration how our workforce is radically changing. They're not in one single location. They have a range of task projects they're doing. All of that complexity we want to bring to the table and think about that complexity, and not just within the narrow scope of productivity, but also thinking about the social and political consequences of that connection or disconnection. So with that, we'll start with Louise's presentation, and then we'll move to our other panelists. We're going to be working from the podium just to make things as smooth as possible for Louise, who's going to be tuned into our conversation, and she'll join us as much as we can make that happen through our limited AV in the world today, but our amazing AV team that has been facilitating this for the latter part of the session. So with that, thank you.
In thinking about the collaborative relationship between real-time writers and their users, I'm thinking about their relationship as a site of social exchange, rather than captioning as a consumer product or a standardized process that's provided by on-demand platforms. Instead, I'm thinking about captioning as provided by real-time writers as the work they do on their dictionary, the maintenance work, the upkeep work, by maintaining contact with their deaf and disabled users. By thinking about their work and thinking about the value of access work, how do we protect the future of what they do, and how do we maintain the relationship between the machine, the sonography machine, and the captioning work they do? How do we embed this relationship into a system that thinks not about automated text, but thinking about the captioning process as a relationship that is maintained and established by users and the workers themselves? To think about this relationship in the context of on-demand captioning services appearing online, we can think about how this poses a threat to the work that real-time writers do. By thinking about this work, and I think it's interesting that increasingly real-time work, real-time demand is increasingly becoming a part of our digital lexicon. But for deaf and hard of hearing users, this has been around for 30 years, since the beginning of the 90s as a result of the ADA and Section 504. So the real-time work that sonographers do has been developed over the last 30 years in ways that they have become an expertise of taking spoken speech and turning it into real-time text, in ways that they become resourceful in working with their client to develop a meaningful dictionary for them to use in classroom situations. In this sense, today I'm briefly talking about the classroom, but real-time work exists across three sections of speech-to-text industries, and that is education, courtroom work, and broadcasting. And they are interlinked in a way that they become important to maintain the integrity and the ethics of the work they do. So in thinking about that relationship and thinking about the value of access workers, I very much am trying to caution against the idea that we can automate captions for some segment of work. This had an impact on the users, deaf users and hard of hearing users, as they lose access to workers themselves. Recently, a major broadcasting group has shifted to use automated text powered by Watson software instead of using real-time captioners. And this has an implication on how deaf and hard of hearing people can access this material.
So thank you, Louise, for starting us off. And each of the speakers are going to give you a bit about their own work, how it connects to the themes of this panel, and then also give you a very specific case that they're working on to be able to put that on the table for our discussion today. Our next speaker is James Woodcock from Oxford University.
Can I do the hands-free?
Yeah.
On. Can you hear me now? Wonderful. So I'm going to speak about technology and work, which of course is ironic given I didn't get the microphone to work at first. And what I want to talk about is some of the ethnographic projects that I have been part of to think about work. Because I think one of the things that has been absent from the conference in various ways is workers. We've talked a lot about the future of work, and I think this session is the only one that actually gestures explicitly to the fact that work involves workers in various ways. And so the first ethnographic project that I did, I worked undercover in a call center. And now the future of work and talking about work is a kind of fashionable thing to be talking about. But when I did my PhD, I was the only student who wanted to talk about work. People said to me, why would you spend your research money talking to workers and hanging around in a call center when you could be doing a million other interesting things? Luckily, it's become a little bit more fashionable to talk about work. And the experience in the call center I want to talk about briefly, and then I want to give an example that speaks to the theme of this session, is I think call centers remain a very important example of work to think about when we think about the role of technology. Because for many workers in call centers, technology has been introduced with very little ability for workers to say, this is a good idea, this is a bad idea, this makes work better or makes work worse. I don't know how many of you have ever worked in a call center. Okay, we've got one or two. How many of us have ever called a call center and had a less than good experience? Okay, so you've had a slight insight into what it's like working in a call center. When I worked in a call center, I sold life insurance to people who didn't want to buy life insurance. I'm not particularly good at selling life insurance to people. But the experience for many workers was that everything you did was timed to the second. How long you spent on calls, how long you spent in between calls, every sale was counted, everything was digitally recorded. And so there was an intense feeling of supervision in the workplace. Every moment was expected to be productive. You were kind of constantly meant to be finding ways to sell life insurance on a cold call. Now, why I think it's important to think about these kind of examples of call center work in the UK is broadly considered to be bad work. It has a huge turnover. People don't want to work in this sector. is I think call center work is very important for understanding the growth of new forms of work today. So platform work, delivering food or working for Uber or so on. And what I want to give for my example is a story about a gig worker in the UK and how they've interacted with technology in various ways. Now, while I worked in a call center, and I was eventually fired for not being good enough for working in the call center, but that's a whole nother story.
Our gain. Our gain.
Indeed, your gain. I'm much better at making bad jokes with a microphone than I am at selling life insurance. We've had a huge growth of platforms like Uber Eats in London. The most dominant one is called Deliveroo. So this is a food delivery platform where people either cycle or they deliver food on a motorbike. Now, for various reasons, I'm not a very confident cyclist. Instead of actually working for Deliveroo, I spent a long periods of time since 2016 interviewing Deliveroo drivers and talking to them about their experience of work. Deliveroo, like many of these platforms, is algorithmically driven. There's very little contact with anything like an organizational chart at Deliveroo. And so I started co-writing papers with a Deliveroo driver, somebody who I'd met by talking to when he was delivering pizza. And I think his story, and many of these workers, it is his story because of the gendering of this kind of work, I think speaks to the experience of the application of technology to this kind of work. So this driver had never met anybody who worked for Deliveroo. He'd never met an employee of the company. He arrived one day at a shipping container in southeast London where he was given a uniform. He had the app downloaded on his phone. And if anything ever went wrong, he would call somebody who wasn't directly employed by the company. So his experience of the organization was very different to what most of us might expect. He had an interest in discovering how much he cycled, what his kind of performance was at work. And whenever he asked for performance statistics, he never got a reply. And so one of the projects that we developed was self-tracking himself as he cycled around London, trying to make sense of the experience from his perspective, seeing how fast he went, where he went to, the most common routes, how much money he made, and so on. And so we produced a series of these large maps, which maybe this would be the point where a PowerPoint might have been useful, but heat maps of his own performance, all of which is data that the platform had, but wouldn't give over to him. And so whenever he had contact with the platform, what they would tell him is not, you've performed 5 out of 10, or you've met your statistics or whatever. He was always told whether or not he had met a performance statistic or not. He was never told whether he'd comfortably met it. He was never told by how many seconds. Just this week, you have met performance metric A, B, C, and D. And so he said the experience of this work was very, very difficult because he didn't know whether he was meeting the targets by 1 second, by a minute, by 3 minutes, or whatever it was. And I think this is a kind of interesting problem for food delivery. I don't know how many of you want your pizza to arrive in 20 minutes exactly. Usually I forget if I order something, and if it's 25 minutes, it's not a big deal for me. But for this platform, there's an incredible demand on making sure that every possible second is shaved off the delivery time. And so we did a whole series of interviews. We wrote these papers together. And at one point, I asked this delivery driver, what's the hardest thing about working for a food delivery platform? And what I thought he would say is, it's hard not having a real manager. It's hard not being able to challenge if I don't make a performance metric or whatever it is. It's hard not having a proper employment contract. It's hard not having workplace rights or whatever it is. But he didn't say any of these things. And what he said, I think, is a really important point about this new kind of work. Is he said, I get up in the morning, and I'm not really a breakfast person. I said, OK, I'm not quite sure where this is going. He said, I go to my first job, where I work in a cafe, and I serve people coffee on their way to work. So as it gets to lunchtime, I try and have a quick snack, and then I deliver other people's food over lunchtime. I then go back to work in my third job, where I try successfully and unsuccessfully to sell people books in a bookshop. So I get to the end of my shift, and I try and have some kind of snack, and then I deliver other people's food for the rest of the evening. He said the hardest thing is once I've done all of that cycling and worked all of those jobs, is when I get home having enough energy to cook enough calories that I can repeat the entire process again the next day. And I think in a sense, when we think of these platforms, whether it's Uber or Deliveroo, we can often think about the technological innovations of algorithmically driven demand, of scheduling and so on. We can think of the kind of technology that's used here. But what that driver said is a damning indictment that the majority of his customers are workers who are too tired to cook their own food. We have very, very glossy marketing in the UK of Deliveroo will bring you crushed avocado on toast and sushi for your millennial lifestyle in central London. The reality is it's mostly cheap food for workers who are tired. He says that the major problem for him is to deliver calories to people who are too tired, that it makes him too tired to eat himself. And I think the reason I tell this story is to remind people that when we talk about work and we talk about the future of work, this has impacts and implications for the people that do it. And particularly when we talk about productivity, if you see a map of different points, drivers and customers and restaurants, and think about how to optimize that in various ways, what that means for the person that's delivering the food is higher risk of road traffic accidents, being more tired on their way home, all to shave 1 or 2 minutes off a delivery time. And so I think when we have these kind of discussions and think about technology, we have to think about the way that technology is enacted in practice in various ways. And what I want to finish on is to talk about how this driver, along with many other drivers, has used technology themselves to think about how they can reorientate a platform like this. I'm never entirely sure how popular WhatsApp is in the US, but in the UK it's fairly ubiquitous, particularly with migrant communities, which make up many of the drivers on these platforms. And when I asked this driver, do you speak to other people in your workplace, you know, the kind of in the city? He said, of course I do. He said, let me invite you to one of these WhatsApp groups with 300 or 400 drivers in the neighborhood sharing experiences about the best restaurants to wait outside and so on. Is in amongst the kind of gaps in the algorithms of these platforms, workers find new uses for technology. And often those are to push back against the worst aspects of these platforms. But they also give us the possibility of imagining how technology could be used in very, very different ways. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Jackie ONeill from Microsoft Research, is our next speaker.
I do. Can you hear me? Is my mic on? Is that good? Okie dokie. Which way around does this go? I guess we'll find out. Yay. Okay, so I'm Jackie ONeill. I'm an ethnographer at Microsoft Research in India. And my research interest is thinking about how we can design technology to help people have better working lives. I have a focus on the Global South, but not only on the Global South. And the topic of this workshop is very close, or this panel is very close to my heart. I've been studying gig work, crowd work, and informal economies since 2011. And I've been designing workplace technology that hopefully fits with workers' practice for much longer than that. So it was great, actually, that Jamie came before me, because I want to talk about 2 parallel workplace trends that we see transforming the world of work. The first is the adoption of chat as a workplace tool. And the second is the rise of the platform economy. So if you don't see a connection, bear with me. I'm hopefully going to draw one. So workplace adoption of chat. WeChat, WhatsApp are becoming almost as ubiquitous as the smartphones on which they run. And one of the really interesting things is that we see workers using them. They are widely used by many of the 2.7 billion workers who don't work in offices. They work in transportation, they work in retail, they work in agriculture, healthcare, government, banking. all of these things. And I'm going to talk about 2 trends in the adoption of chat in the workplace. The first is that chat adoption is often worker-driven, which is something that really intrigues me as a workplace technology specialist. And my studies of banking, government work, healthcare show that people adopt it for the workplace because it's lightweight, it's flexible, it's mobile, and very crucially, it's easy to understand and to adapt to the local needs of non-technical people. It doesn't require much of a ramp up, much of a learning curve, because most people are actually using it already for their personal lives. So they can just adapt it to their work lives. And then what's really interesting, you can send text messages, you can send voice messages, you can send photos. Now, of course, you can take a photo of pretty much anything. You can take a photo of a handwritten paper document. You can take a photo of a typed document. You can take a photo of a screen. You can take a photo of some plants in a field. You can take a photo of yourself. And you can also share videos and documents and links. It is amazing what type of workflows you can construct from these pieces. And it supports just-in-time workflows, so you're on the move, you're out and about. You can send a message right there and then. You don't have to wait till you get to a desktop, and many of the workers that I work with don't even have a desktop. And one of the things that we find is that it's the glue. Chat is often the glue that sticks together diverse systems, which can be paper and can be digital, but which don't talk to one another and are often not flexible enough to fit the needs of the workers. And it sticks these systems together with the diverse work practices of highly mobile, time-pressed workers. So that's the first chat trend. The second one is that chat is being adopted as a way of supporting new organizational forms. So if you're thinking about providing, how you want to provide services, well-needed services to rural people in the global south. Quite often, the companies that do this have to create very innovative organizational forms. They have highly distributed workforces and new business models. So I want to give you the example here of Well Told Story. Now, Well Told Story is a youth empowerment magazine. It's created by two small teams, one in Nairobi and one in Dar es Salaam. And it tells stories to get across important messages from financial literacy to sexual health. And it has over 1 million subscribers. This is a monthly magazine. They could not survive without their network of 3,000 distributors. These distributors don't work for them, okay? They are small local entrepreneurs, young people basically with small businesses all over Tanzania and Kenya. It might be a barber shop, it might be a cafe. And basically they stock the magazine for free. They don't get paid for this, partly to support youth empowerment and partly to increase footfall through their business. And then the other thing that Well Told Story does is it has to take the pulse of young people regularly through surveys. And the problem with this is if you've got people all over Kenya and people all over Tanzania, distance is a barrier and increases costs. So one thing that they're doing is that they're managing this distributed ecosystem because they've adopted chat tools which have programmable APIs. So they're creating new workflows and new ways to communicate. So this can be talking to their distributors and engaging their customers. And it's really interesting to see these highly innovative organizations managing to get services across countries like this. So now I want to move on to the second workplace trend, which is the rise of the platform economy. I've been studying crowd work through Amazon Mechanical Turk in the US and India, and platform work, physical work, such as ride sharing. This is Ola, India's Uber, and I've also studied Uber in India. Now, digital work and physical work are really quite different. They are different types of work, and they have different workforces. But what's really interesting is when they're mediated by a platform and they're managed algorithmically, there's a remarkably consistent worker experience. Now, myself and people at this table and many people in this room have documented very well some of the challenges for workers of working on these platform economies. So I just want to highlight a few of them briefly. So the first is the platform acts as a digital middleman. So it's in the middle between the customers or the people with the work and the people doing the work. And it erodes independence because you can no longer negotiate about your jobs. Most of these platforms deliberately design collaboration out of the workplace, but workers still collaborate. And we see networks of digital and physical networks of colleagues who help and support one another, such as your WhatsApp group of workers for delivery. And of course, algorithmic management treats all workers as interchangeable units distinguished only by their ratings, whereas of course we know that individual people have individual skills and talents and requirements. So we have two trends. On the one side, we have the rather positive trend, which is that we're seeing lightweight mobile tools being adopted by workers to support their practices and supporting new organizational forms that can provide services that adapt to local needs, often in extreme circumstances. On the other hand, we have a rather negative trend, which is the rise of the platform economy, which certainly provides jobs and customer value. However, the way that platforms are currently designed tends to be adversarial and doesn't really benefit the workers. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can think of creative ways of bringing these two trends together to create a better future of work. So I want to talk about two, just very, very briefly, as it's just my position statement. I could go on for hours, of course. Two small trends that we should think about. One is thinking about how we might empower workers, because we can't rely on the platforms to do it. But the second is we should also think about how we can design better platforms. While some of the bigger players might never be going to change their work practices or care about their workers, there are lots of smaller platforms out there which really do care about their workers, if only they could think about how they could be designed better. So if we think about empowering workers and going beyond the platform, we can think about ways we might use chat to create a connected workforce. So building the relationships back between the workers. And this is important for friendship, motivation, technical troubleshooting, collaboration, support. It's so important for so many things. And when we augment chat with programmable APIs, we can think about how we might build worker platforms and worker-centric platforms that enable workers to connect in communities of practice, but also geographic communities. And these platforms can be used for reporting grievances and supporting collective action, and also for enabling workers to organize, to get together, to work together in more flexible ways than the current platform economy allows. And then the second one is we can think about how we design better platforms. And basically, you could quite simply start designing chat into these platforms themselves. It doesn't have to be a separate thing. And we can do this to build the relationship back between the employers or customers and the workers. This might be long-term in crowd work. You might actually want to have a long-term engagement with your workers. And we actually saw on Amazon Mechanical Turk, people worked around AMT to have long-term relationships with their workers. Or in physical work, it might just be for a short time. You're just coming together to get a service done. You might want to talk about it. It also can be used to build relationships between the platforms and the workers. Platforms tend to be rather opaque and unapproachable. And you could think about how you could have facilitated chat groups to offer both peer support and to reduce the adversarial relationship between the platform and the workers. And finally, to build relationships between the workers for all the reasons we talked about on the previous slide. So I hope that I have shown you some ideas for how we can think about building a more positive future. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. And finally, our last speaker, Mary Gray. And in some ways, I'm going to, I'm hitting a drum beat here that you're hearing across all of the presentations. And I'm going to just selfishly plug this book that co-authored with Siddharth Suri, but mostly I'm going to pull some very specific findings from the book to be able to queue up thinking about this connection, but also to frame it within what are the challenges of connection alone, and where we need to shore up how we're thinking about fostering identification and collective action. What would that look like? So connection, beyond connection, collaboration that's meaningful and recognized. And you can't really do research like this without feeling incredibly indebted to the hundreds of people who gave time to be able to share their experiences, let us into their homes, the thousands of people who did surveys across the 4 platforms that we studied and 2 countries. And it was really very much an interdisciplinary team effort. So I do want to clear the weeds here. What do we mean by ghost work? The term itself is actually meant to point to the work conditions. It's not the workers themselves. The workers are quite aware of each other. It's to say, what is it that we're doing when we create work that's not just a niche job, if we think about the design of on-demand labor, but rather see it as the dismantlement of full-time employment. So right now we tend to talk about these kinds of platformatization on-demand jobs as specific kinds of jobs, rather than what does it look like to orient to work that's project-driven, project-specific, and at this point defined by contracts, short contracts that can be seconds, or minutes, or hours, or months, but the expectation is that they end because they're oriented around teams of people coming to a project. This might be a familiar map for how does this work? How does this on-demand work work? But think about it in this somewhat static, two-sided market with an intermediary, and imagine all of the kinds of businesses that can course through connecting, at least in part, this task-based contract-driven work that can, at least in part, source, schedule, manage, ship, and bill a project that can course through the internet and an API. Now, if you use that framework, that's a lot of different work. That's most of the kinds of work we do in this room. It can be teaching, it can be writing, it can be event planning, it can be AV work. It can be anything that's involving the kind of deliberative, spontaneous actions that people do today, and being able to match it with this approach that's quite profoundly, I would argue, revolutionary about how it can orient people to projects. It doesn't say go into an office and do a thing. It says I have this project, who's coming? That's a very different orientation to work. And with a different orientation to work, the invitation of all of these platform approaches is to say all comers. What we found across all 4 platforms, and this is fairly common in platform economies, but also in citizen science or any approach that's task-based open call, is that there's a good core group. We called them always on. Again, this is across all the platforms. They're the folks, there's a good core group that are doing most of the work. They're picking most of the project up. That wasn't distinctive about Amazon Mechanical Turk or Universal Human Relevance System or Lead Genius or Mara or any of the other companies we looked at. There was a core group that was doing this work. Hold in mind that often we might think of these as full-time workers, full-time employees, and much of the mantra is, can't we get everybody into the category of always on? Well, the reality is there's a good 20%-ish, and this is clearly not to scale. Sid might not particularly appreciate this graphic. But there's a good core group of folks, regulars, who have picked a time or a number of tasks or a particular kind of set of projects that they go to routinely. They have a way in which they're turning this work and income stream into something they can count on. They're importantly the deep bench that is there. So when anybody who's always on steps away, those folks can step in and no consumer will ever be able to tell the difference. One way we narrate that now is that people are interchangeable. I think the other paradigm we can use is that the capacity for humans to be able to pick up something spontaneously and step into somebody else's shoes to evaluate what do I need to do next, that's distinctly human. We don't have a way of modeling that. We don't have priors. This is the technically hard thing that a human is doing within any process that's meant to capitalize on humans in the loop. And then there's this long tail of experimentalists who are trying things out. They might do one project. They literally do one project and say, peace out, this is awful. Or they've figured there's something else they want to try on a different platform. There's myriad reasons people are coming to this approach to picking up project-based work and being paid for it. There isn't one kind of worker here, and that's important. But importantly, for this approach to task-based work, there isn't a version of this that can survive where everybody's always on, or everybody's a regular, or everybody's an experimentalist. We didn't find a version of this where this worked without this distribution, without this profile. And an argument for why that's true is precisely because the range of motivations, the mix of people and circumstances and contexts in which people are coming to this work is precisely what allows them to enter the door as an experimentalist, test something out. This is the pipeline to becoming somebody who's always on. But importantly, everybody in this mix, they are organizing life around work in other circumstances. In this setting, they get to organize work around their lives. If there was one thing in common, it was everybody is searching for the capacity, not for flexibility, and I would encourage, and some of you have heard me say this before, please stop using the word flexibility to describe this work. This is a way of managing constraints on my life. I can choose work where I can step into this work, try out projects, and there are other motivations I'll mention in a moment. But this organization of work around projects is precisely what allows people to be able to make decisions about how to manage other constraints in their lives. That's the part that's the hardest for us when we're designing platforms to consider. We will never know the circumstances under which somebody is trying to control particular constraints. Designing for that high dimensional variation, the heterogeneity here, is the technical challenge. That Pareto distribution means that it's creating a lot of different mental maps for what it is that people are doing. So when I ask folks, can you describe what you do to other people? I can hear responses in the US that range from, I work for a startup in Silicon Valley, or I'm self-employed, I'm building my skills, or from someone in India, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm bringing jobs to my village. And they're all working on the same platform, doing the exact same types of tasks. So importantly, this range of mental models means they don't share a common identity as workers or of the same kind of worker. And anybody who's a student of social movement and social action knows social movement begins with having a shared identity, a sense of a shared common cause. That is fundamentally the first thing you build when you're doing organizing. Do we see each other as kindred in kind or sharing a particular need? Until that's in place, it's very difficult to organize around a common cause. These folks are doing work. They don't identify as the same type of worker. So when they connect, and they do connect, and this is certainly speaking to Jackie, some of Jackie's earlier work, to what Jamie was discussing. This is one example of a model that we built of workers on Amazon Mechanical Turk connecting. The coloration that you see are the different sub-communities of Amazon Mechanical Work workers who had built their own discussion forums and different ways of connecting. But people were also, the number of points you see are singletons of folks who are those experimentalists, those regulars who don't necessarily pipe into a specific sub-forum or sub-community. But folks are also connecting via text. They're hanging out on Skype, working together to get through night shifts of their own setting. So people do collaborate. What we found were the folks who were most densely connected and collaborating, who have perhaps the greatest potential for forming identities around collective action and common cause, were the ones who were always on, that 10%. They're heavily invested in what they're doing, and they know that if they connect, they're going to be able to share costs. They'll be able to reduce their own costs of identifying bad actors, of being able to get good recommendations for how to do the work they're doing, of literally just having somebody else say, good job. Like folks were turning to each other for that fundamental, not technical need for connecting, a deeply social need for connecting. Technology will not fix or replace the social need for connecting. So how would technology be a part of facilitating that and perhaps identifying places where folks have not connected? What are the on-ramps to those connections that are meaningful to them, that are not the equivalent of the boss building a break room where they say, please use my break room. It turns out most folks were creating their own channels, even when in the circumstances of the 2 companies we studied that did build in structured engineered communication, workers, of course, went and built their own ways of connecting. So how do we facilitate that, recognize it, respect it, and stop trying to engineer it out? So the key takeaways for thinking about the ways in which a world of workers could connect and how we could facilitate it as technologists is to work with the assumption there is no single work site. I think one of the greatest challenges we face today is most of our tooling that we build tends to work from the starting point of, I've got a shared work site and we all have a way of authenticating each other's identities and I trust you from the beginning, go. And in this world, it's building with the opposite assumption. I don't know you yet. I might not know you for very long. We're about to work on a project. Go. We're literally doing the opposite still because it's easier, technically, to build, say, a communication system that assumes everybody's on the same organization, hypothetically Teams, for example, just to critique a product that Microsoft recently built. To assume there's no sole employer of record, that most of the workers orienting the projects, there's multiple projects. So I don't have a single client. And it's quite dizzying to imagine a platform as the employer. That's not obviously the case. In some cases, it might be true, and we could more easily deal with the question of, say, an Uber, is it the employer of record? Should everybody be identified as and classified as an employee if they work for Uber? I think in some ways we'd be able to see a much more revolutionary shift if all of us recognize if you're using Uber, you're the employer of record. What are your responsibilities to that driver? You're their client. And we haven't moved there yet. As consumers of these products that deeply benefit from the activities of myriad workers we'll never see, we'll never meet. Importantly, there's no unifying professional identity or career yet. So you could imagine, say, something like content moderation, which was something we were also looking at within this mix, because that's in the portfolio of work that on-demand workers do, that content review and moderation is surfacing as a profession. What does it mean to support that identity? Even if done on a freelancing basis, what would it look like for us to facilitate that? Is it certification? What are the ways in which there would be for professional communities that organize around that kind of work? But without professional identity, it is very difficult to organize a labor work site condition. You have to have folks who are the point of reference for, well, what does it mean to treat academics professionally? What do they usually get for salary, for office space? Without that point of reference, work conditions erode. And this is a global network for a lot of the work we're talking about, particularly if it involves information services and knowledge work. There's quite a bit of localization happening. So the real value isn't the offshoring of the work. It's that I have somebody who has the cultural and linguistic chops to be able to help me develop a product or a service that's going to be in their language, in their location, serving somebody on the ground in that spot. So it's contending with, this is no longer the familiar and perhaps ugly world of labor arbitrage, where it's about how do I reduce my labor costs by moving it over there. It is recognizing there are emerging markets that are now paid differentially for the same type of labor. How are we going to contend with that when workers themselves can see when they're being paid less than another national workforce? And they're calling the question on why are we paid differently? So the thing I would like to leave us with and then move into our Q&A is to think about how we would approach connecting worlds of workers as a commons, not as individuals who are invested in and selfishly possessed by a single employer, but that we're facilitating a way of tending this commons and connecting a commons of workers who are oriented to projects and tasks that are in fundamental ways now facilitated not just by algorithmic management, but by technical systems that are effectively their conduits to each other, to their forms of income, and to their forms of advocacy. So with that, let me end there, bring us all up if I could, and we'll bring Louise into the conversation.